This is the early morning of the 7th of December 2025. I might do this in two parts because I don't trust this software on Photo Booth. This clip plays for 25 minutes, so the first segment will run around 12 minutes. Put up by Geopolitical Economy Reports. Why Trump freed one of the world's drug traffickers. Let's have a listen to what's said. Again, this will be done in two parts.
The more you learn about the politics and especially the foreign policy of the United States, the more you see how extremely hypocritical it is, how the US government says something while doing the opposite. We saw one of the clearest examples of this hypocrisy this December when US President Donald Trump pardoned and released from prison one of the worst drug traffickers on earth, the former dictator of Honduras, named Juan Orlando Hernandez. Now, when Juan Orlando Hernandez was the dictator of Honduras from 2014 until 2022, he was a loyal right-wing U.S. ally who obediently served U.S. interests in Latin America and allowed the U.S. military to operate large military bases inside Honduras. Yet throughout this time, he was operating one of the largest drug trafficking operations on the planet. The U.S. government admitted this because even though Hernandez was a loyal U.S. ally, he was flooding the U.S. with cocaine, which was, of course, exacerbating the drug crisis in the U.S. So the U.S. Department of Justice later convicted him and sentenced Hernandez to 45 years in prison for distributing more than 400 tons of cocaine and also trafficking machine guns. The U.S. Department of Justice ruling noted that Hernandez was, quote, at the center of one of the largest and most violent drug trafficking conspiracies in the world. His conspirators were armed with machine guns and destructive devices, including AK-47s and grenade launchers, which they used to protect their massive cocaine loads as they transited across Honduras on their way to the United States. And Hernandez even worked with the notorious Mexican cartel leader El Chapo Guzman. El Chapo gave $1 million bribe to the brother of this Honduran dictator to get support from the Honduran regime. And while Hernandez was trafficking all these drugs, he was a loyal U.S. ally, not only under Donald Trump, but also under Barack Obama and his vice president, Joe Biden, because U.S. imperialism in Latin America is completely bipartisan in U.S. politics. But during Donald Trump's first term as U.S. president, starting in 2017, Juan Orlando Hernandez was a close U.S. ally, and in particular, Trump was using Honduras in order to put pressure on the left-wing Sandinista government in neighboring Nicaragua. And also in 2019, Honduras backed Donald Trump's coup attempt in Venezuela. And this shows how the hypocrisy is even more outrageous, because today, in 2025, Trump is waging a blatant war of aggression against Venezuela to try to overthrow Venezuela's government, continuing the failed coup attempt that Trump started during his first term as U.S. president back in 2019. And just as back then, Trump was allied with these drug trafficking dictators like Juan Orlando Hernandez, today, Trump continues to support the worst drug traffickers in the region. He just released one of them from prison. Meanwhile, Trump is waging a war against Venezuela, which he claims is about stopping drug trafficking networks, in scare quotes, which at this point, you have to be a child to actually believe this nonsense. It is so patently ridiculous. It is an obvious lie. Yeah, the Trump administration has been bombing Venezuelan boats nonstop, including Secretary of War Pete Hegseth, previously known as the Secretary of Defense, although he renamed the Pentagon proudly as the Department of War. War Secretary Pete Hegseth oversaw double tap strikes on Venezuelans in these boats So after the U.S. military bombed this boat, they then hit it another time to make sure there were no survivors. And by the way, there's no evidence whatsoever that these are drug traffickers in these boats. In many cases, they have simply been fishermen trying to make a living for their humble families. And yet the Trump administration is bombing them out of the water and then hitting them again to make sure there are no survivors. This is a blatant war crime against international law. And even if they were drug traffickers, by the way, the U.S. cannot just execute them like this without any charges or trial. These are foreigners in international waters. This is absolutely crazy. Yet the hypocrisy of the U.S. government has become so blatant that even mainstream Western media outlets like the British newspaper The Guardian, which is very anti-Venezuela and is constantly publishing ridiculous propaganda about Venezuela, even they are now being forced to acknowledge that, as this headline says in an article, Trump's move to pardon Honduras's ex-president shows counter-drug effort is based on lies and hypocrisy. The entire world can see this. Trump claims he has to overthrow Venezuela's government supposedly to stop drug trafficking, which is a blatant lie. Meanwhile, he is pardoning and freeing the worst drug traffickers on earth. Now, to be fair, even an American journalist asked Trump about this to his face in the presidential plane. The journalist said, if you claim that you want to stop drug trafficking, why did you release this notorious drug trafficker? And Trump absurdly claimed that Juan Orlando Hernandez was framed by the Biden administration, and the charges that he trafficked over 400 tons of cocaine were all manufactured for political reasons. Now, this is an absolutely hilarious lie because the investigation into Hernandez's drug trafficking started during Trump's first term as U.S. president. In fact, back in 2019, the Associated Press reported that U.S. federal prosecutors accused Honduras's so-called president, its dictator, Juan Orlando Hernandez, of using $1.5 million in drug trafficking proceeds to secure the presidency in 2013. So he stole the election with drug money. These were U.S. federal prosecutors saying this back when Trump was president in his first term. So this did not start under Joe Biden. This was not politically motivated. But listen to this clip here of Trump when he's asked about it. It is completely absurd.
You also pardoned the former president of Honduras, and he was released from prison yesterday.
Well, he was the president, and they had some drugs being sold in their country, and because he was the president, they went after him. That was a Biden horrible witch hunt, which was, a lot of people in Honduras asked me to do that, and I did it. I feel very good about it. If you have some drug dealers in your country and you're the president, you don't necessarily put the president in jail for 45 years. That was a Biden-inspired witch hunt.
Apple cider vinegar for toenail.
That just popped up.
Inconvenient truth is that the narco dictatorship in Honduras had bipartisan support from the U.S. government under Trump in his first term and under the Obama administration when Biden was also vice president. Both U.S. political parties supported this right-wing narco dictatorship in Honduras because it served the interests of the U.S. empire in Latin America. And in fact, we cannot understand this history if we ignore the fact that in 2009, when Obama was U.S. president and when Hillary Clinton was the Secretary of State, the U.S. backed a coup in Honduras against the democratically elected left-wing president, Manuel Zelaya. The military overthrew the elected left-wing president and put in power an unelected right-wing coup regime, and the U.S. government supported this. And this ironically fueled the immigration crisis in the U.S., because after the U.S.-backed coup in Honduras in 2009, the homicide rate in Honduras skyrocketed. Honduras became one of the most violent countries on earth, which led to a flood of immigrants and refugees, including children, fleeing Honduras and going north, seeking refuge because there is so much violence. Honduras, under the U.S.-backed narco dictatorship, became one of the most violent countries on earth that wasn't at war. And then in 2013, the U.S.-backed narco dictator, Juan Orlando Hernandez, stole the election, with drug money, and he stole that election from the left-wing presidential candidate Xiomara Castro from the left-wing Libre Party. I'll come back to her in a minute here. But Hernandez stole the election in 2013, and then he stole another election in 2017, and everyone knows he committed fraud. It was blatant fraud in broad daylight. And by the way, according to the Honduran constitution, a president is not eligible for re-election. There's a limit of just one presidential term. And yet this dictator had 2 terms, and the US government rubber-stamped his fake election that he stole. And by the way, the European Union also recognized this fake stolen election from this narco dictator, which shows how, the EU, which pretends to care about democracy and human rights, is just as hypocritical as the United States. Just the EU has slightly better marketing than Washington does. But the point that I'm stressing here is that the Western powers, especially the US government, have been meddling in Honduras for decades, in the case of the US for centuries. But in particular, in the past 20 years, the US government has repeatedly undermined Honduras's democracy and put in power corrupt puppets who were drug dealers. And we saw yet another example of this November, because on the 30th of November, 2025, Honduras had another election, which also was marred by very serious accusations of electoral fraud. And just a few days before that election, Trump publicly meddled in Honduras's internal affairs and meddled in its elections. And Trump went out in public and he endorsed the right-wing candidate Tito Asfura, who is from the right-wing National Party of, can you guess it, Juan Orlando Hernandez. This is one of the most corrupt, drug cartel-linked parties on earth. Everyone knows they are drug dealers, and Trump publicly came out and endorsed them. And he said, quote, "The only real friend of freedom in Honduras is Tito Asfura. Tito and I can work together to fight the narco-communists," end quote. So
at the end of the first segment, you sort of get the picture, huh? Yeah, it's just a joke. The whole thing's a joke. Trump's a complete effing moron. Stand by for part 2. The reason I play all these videos is so I can learn what's going on, so I can talk intelligently. And most of you folks just get on, you click, and this is too long, and you go elsewhere. You shouldn't be doing that. You're missing what you need to know, but it is what it is. Stand by for part 2. Pass it along. And for the few of you that listen, thanks for doing so. Give it a like, subscribe, help grow my channel.